and a warm welcome to the Open Treasury podcast, your go-to source for the latest news and analysis in corporate cash and treasury management. This show is brought to you by ctmfile.com and the Treasury News Network, where treasury professionals learn and share the information that matters most. I am your host, Pushpendra Mehta. Joining me today is Paul Galloway, Senior Director, Advisory Services at Strategic Treasurer. Welcome back, Paul, to another episode of the Open Treasury podcast.
Thanks for having me, Push.
We truly appreciate your time and insights as we explore critical topics shaping the landscape of corporate cash and treasury management. In today's edition, we shall discuss 4 topics, namely the first of the 4-part article series titled Top 8 Priority Areas for Corporate Treasury in 2024, ING to ditch upstream oil and gas business by 2040, Asian Development Bank bullish on growth in India and China, and finally, China uses digital yuan for gold cross-border payments. Our audience can read articles, interviews, and industry roundups by visiting ctmfile.com or by following the links in our show notes. Paul, let's begin today's discussion with the first story, which is about part 1 of the 4-part article series titled Top 8 Priority Areas for Corporate Treasury in 2024. Corporate finance and treasury professionals will enter 2024, a year considered as the biggest election year in history, with over 70 countries heading to the polls. According to The Economist, in 2024, close to 2 billion people in more than 70 countries will head to the polls. Ballots will be cast from Britain to Bangladesh, from India to Indonesia. Yet, what sounds like it should be a triumphant year for democracy will be the opposite. Furthermore, with social media, generative artificial intelligence, political and business leadership expected to influence many election outcomes, the results are likely to impact geopolitical coordination on key global economic issues. On one hand, corporate treasury executives will have to face the next source of turbulence in the polycrisis era, a packed 2024 election calendar, as reported by Bloomberg in an article published in October. On the other hand, treasury and finance professionals have to reckon with geopolitical instability driven by the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war and the Israel-Palestine conflict. Additionally, the cumulative impact of 5 years of the US-China trade war and geopolitical tensions related to Taiwan, Korea, and Russia-NATO are now believed to pose the greatest risk to the global economy in both the near term and medium term, as per the Oxford Economics latest Global Risk Survey report. Furthermore, the Financial Times, in a recently published article, has said that the Biden administration is currently trying to deal with wars in the Middle East and Europe while preparing for a surge in tensions between China and Taiwan. If, as the Financial Times forewarned, over the course of the year, China could take its military intimidation of Taiwan to new levels, particularly if the US looks distracted and weakened by events in Ukraine and the Middle East. This could intensify geopolitical tensions, trigger more trade restrictions, and pose a significant risk to the global economy. Paul, the interplay of a series of high-profile global elections and rising geopolitical instability stand to bring about greater international economic divergence, trade conflicts, and political fragmentation across key regions, directly impacting multinational corporations' supply chains and customer bases. What do you think corporations and their treasury teams can do to prepare to navigate the geopolitical challenges of the upcoming year?
Well, Push, this article outlines several things in here. There are going to be challenges coming into 2024. I'll start with the political elections coming up here. And certainly, probably the biggest one on everybody's radar screen is the presidential election in the U.S. This is certainly a big one that people are going to keep their eyes on. It's still unclear whether there's going to be challenges to who can be on a ballot and who's not. We've seen in the state of Colorado, they've elected to take former President Trump off the ballot. That has moved to the Supreme Court to determine whether that can be done or not. So there'll be some precedent set in the review of that. My gut feeling is that I think the people should have the power to elect. That's the way our government was formed here in the U.S. So I think what will happen is that will be found to be illegal to do. So I think former President Trump stays on the ballot. So now it becomes, who are the people going to feel more comfortable with between current President Biden, prior President Trump. I think there's pluses and minuses to both sides of that people are looking at. And so it's a huge political thing. And there's definitely some divide going on in the U.S., which is uncommon in terms of how deep that's become. So I know the U.S. isn't the only country out there that is facing some political challenges. I think this is something that's broader than just the U.S. alone, but one that's probably more significant is the one in the U.S. So there's lots of things to consider because we have countries that are utilizing social media and other tactics to provide disinformation, misinformation, things that appear to be true that are not that are not factual or not true. Everybody's heard President Trump call stuff fake news. Well, there is fake news out there. There absolutely is. And so there's propaganda that's being spread through social media and other avenues. So this makes politics that much more challenging. And for people to decide or decipher, who's the right candidate, it's being challenged by the use of these technologies, especially with generative artificial intelligence, AI. This is now going to take that exploitation to a new level. I think we're going to see and hear things out there. I think people will be able to determine, hey, some of this stuff is just too wild to even believe. So it's just a different era. It's a different time. So I think it's become more challenging from a political view. There's definitely things for treasurers to consider because policy making from a presidential standpoint does have an impact on the economy. The things that governments do or don't do can have an impact. Our government has been spending a lot of money in recent years, and that's definitely had an impact on the U.S. We're at a point where high interest rates, inflation still is persistent. I think 2024 is going to be a challenging year from an economic standpoint. We'll see what happens with interest rates. It depends on some of the economic factors we're going to see in Q1, Q2 of 2024. I don't think we see much movement, if any at all, in the first half of the year. I think the second half of the year is where we may see it. I think there'll be some economic pressures that could have a significant impact on polls and who people want to have as president. It always comes down to the economy for a president. It can win it or lose it for him. So we'll see where things stand. From a geopolitical standpoint, conflicts. Boy, yeah, we've got lots of conflicts out there. Russia and Ukraine, Israel and the Gaza Strip going after Hamas. We have other terrorist organizations in the Middle East that have been engaging in activity as well. Is the U.S. distracted? I think there is some distraction because there's a lot of things going on. Is the U.S. weakened? I wouldn't say necessarily weakened, but we have not been coming out in a way that would be normal for the U.S., which is, tamper down, stop, prevent. It feels like we've been a little bit more lenient, and so people probably look at that as being weak in nature. You have China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran coming together, leaning on each other to battle what they view as their nemesis or enemy, the U.S. We can't ignore that by any means. To think that these countries are friendly towards us, absolutely not. They aren't friendly towards us. And it's a definite challenge to the U.S. to have, countries coming together to go against you. That definitely presents a lot of challenges in 2024. as we move forward. I think in the back of some people's minds, they may be thinking about that. Who would be stronger as a leader from a global standpoint, leading in terms of military action or stance to provocation? I think there's probably a candidate out there that's stronger than the other, and that may have an impact as well. So it could be economic, it could be the international footprint, the things that are happening out there with the conflicts. It could be the tide for who's going to be the next president in the U.S.
You make a great point, and your ability to bring a unique perspective to this important aspect of today's discussion is commendable. Let's now shift our discussion to the next topic, which pertains to the Dutch financial institution ING's announcement that it plans to end all financing of upstream oil and gas projects by the year 2040 and aims to triple its funding of renewable energy over the next 2 years. The Dutch multinational bank expects to boost its financing of renewable power generation to euro 7.5 billion or US $8.2 billion annually by 2025, up from 2.5 billion euros in 2022. It will also cut loans for oil and gas exploration and production by 35% by 2030. By 2040, the financed emissions linked to its portfolio will be reduced to zero, ING said. ING confirmed that it had taken the decision after world leaders at the COP28 climate summit in Dubai earlier this month agreed to transition away from fossil fuels while tripling global green energy capacity by 2030. Paul, from a multinational corporate treasury perspective, what do you make of ING's decision to end all financing of upstream oil and gas activities while boosting its financing of renewable energy projects?
Well, Push, I think these bank financials, even non-bank financials, have decisions to make about, what do they support, what do they not support. Not surprising that we see necessarily ING Group doing this. This probably makes sense from a standpoint of, their character and who they are as an organization. Do I think this means that we're going to have a lot of financials and non-bank financials following suit? Not necessarily. I think, the transition to clean energy, renewable energy, as we term this nowadays, I think that transition is probably not as abrupt or as sudden as most anticipate. I think there are definite challenges ahead, and this climate summit is helping to try to address those. I think there's acknowledgement at some level that fossil fuels don't go away perhaps as quick as we want or need them to. So I think there has to be things to mitigate the risks of what's happening with the utilization of these fuels to generate power or transport us. So I think when it comes to clean energy, I think there's lots of people out there who will say, yeah, this makes sense. We should move towards this. And I don't think there's a lot of people that are saying we shouldn't do it. I think the challenge is as a globe, as a world, not just individual nations, are we going to rise to the occasion to take the steps and do the things we need to do? That's the bigger question. A summit like this is trying to address that so that we can all come together to do something that's going to be beneficial for Mother Earth, period. And all the creatures and the plants and the people that live in the world, we've got to take care of the planet at the same time. So we can't just continue to do things the same old way. So I think what's going to come out of it is probably more around innovation. Adoption, transition. How do we become smarter with what we have? How do we do this better? How can we make things more amenable for people to complete the transition? Building out the infrastructure that's needed. I've thought about this myself. What does that look like? If I'm just thinking of just the U.S. alone, we've got a lot of vehicles in the U.S. that are still combustion engines. We're getting more and more that are hybrid or electrical vehicles. But infrastructure to accommodate the entire U.S. footprint to an EV environment, we still have a long ways to go. So there's got to be investment in that. I do have some concerns around a couple things. One around power grids, transmission lines, the ability to support the demand of electricity. Will we have issues with rolling blackouts? Are we going to have issues with the grid not being in the right position to handle that? That's going to take a lot of investment. We're also going to need, powering stations. Instead of gas stations, it's powering stations. So we need powering stations all over. How are you going to do this in rural areas like Iowa, where I live? We have lots of farm communities. They're small. They're very spread out. How do you do that? How does that work? I wouldn't even imagine what it takes to create an electrical combine, a tractor that is, tractors that are utilized by farmers today to farm. What does that look like? How much power does that take? We got to realize that you can't just put up power plants real quickly. So we have an existing platform that we can utilize, but to get to cleaner energy, we're going to have to expand the efforts on clean energy to supply power, electricity, wind, solar, hydro, otherwise, because a lot of the base load today in the U.S. is still coal plants, nuclear power plants. Wind farms are base load power, and you're seeing more and more wind farms being built in the U.S. Matter of fact, in Iowa, I worked for Mid-American Energy Company on a couple power plant wind farm projects for the organization, and they've done more and more since I left the company. They really put up a lot of wind turbines here in Iowa. Those are base load plants. We're going to need more stuff like that, if we want to have clean energy, because dealing with spent nuclear power rods, fuel rods, is not something that we want to have more of necessarily. I think there's some challenges with batteries utilized in electric vehicles. Probably heard stories of cars, some of these electrical vehicles, the batteries catch on fire and they burn at a very high temperature. They're hard to put out the fire. You have to deal with how you have a battery that is no longer good. How do you dispose of that battery? So we've got some challenges that we still got to figure out on that side. So I think there's just still a lot of work that needs to be done in order for us to take that next step towards being fossil fuel independent. I just don't see that going away anytime soon, or as perhaps as quickly as people want it to. So more work, I think, for us. My hope is that we see more investment in innovation to get us there. And I think maybe that's the point that ING was making here. Hey, we're turning away from supporting this so that, they're going to have to go find funding somewhere else. We're going to focus on making investments in the renewable space that generates innovation so that we've got something that puts us in a better place.
Paul, those are incredible insights, and I couldn't agree more with you, particularly with your comments on innovation and the importance of all of us coming together to make a difference, as well as the importance of making a bold move as ING has. Let's move forward to the third story that merits discussion. This revolves around the Asian Development Bank, or the ADB, being bullish about growth in India and China. The ADB has raised its 2023 economic forecast for developing economies in Asia and the Pacific after robust domestic demand drove higher than expected growth in China and India. According to ADB's, China economy is projected to expand by 5.2% this year against a previous forecast of 4.9% after household consumption and public investment boosted growth in the third quarter. The growth outlook for India has been raised to 6.7% from 6.3%, following faster than expected expansion in the July-September quarter, driven by double-digit growth in industry. Furthermore, a new report by the Center for Economics and Business Research, a UK based economic consultancy, has predicted that India will become the third economic superpower by 2037, behind the US and China, and a US $10 trillion economy by 2035. Paul, from Treasury viewpoint, are you like the ADB bullish on the growth of India and China, or are you more favorably inclined toward India or China?
Yeah, when I think about growth prospects, I think India is positioned better than China at this time. China's got a lot of economic woes that it's facing internally, which has dampened their growth rate by quite a bit. An expansion of 5.2%, that's not insignificant in terms of growth, but in terms of what China's been doing prior to that, it's definitely lower than where they would like to see it. There's pain along with growth. You got to manage that. It can come back to bite you. I think that's some of what China's been feeling from real estate perspective. And so I think when you have lots of growth, you got to be able to have your balance sheet positioned properly. So if I'm a treasurer in India or China, I need to be thinking about those things. Okay. It's great that we have growth today. However, am I positioned to be able to weather a storm if something goes sideways? All of a sudden, I don't have access to the capital I had before. It's now more expensive to engage in the business activity that I do on a normal basis. I'm not generating as much revenues. There's been demands on cash that have lowered my ability to do some of the things I want to do. So, as a treasurer, if I'm in these environments, I need to also be thinking about how I can mitigate some risks. I need to understand what risks exist. What should I be doing to make sure that my balance sheet's positioned correctly in case something goes sideways? In terms of growth between India and China, these numbers don't surprise me. We've been talking about India earlier in the year. Growth that we're seeing there, I think we're going to continue to see pretty robust growth in India. So I don't see that changing in 2024. These projections support that. India at 6.7, China at 5.2. Several years ago, you probably wouldn't have thought of that necessarily, but India has been growing quite quickly. I think we'll continue to see that. They have, between India and China, they contain a lot of the world's population. It's significant. And when you have lots of people like that and you're able to get some economic footing and growth like this, it can expand quite quickly. It becomes, more the compounding effect of this growth in countries of their size is much more significant than other countries would feel. So this is something where I'm a treasurer. I need to be really looking into the future and trying to figure out what risks could impact my organization. It might not be the same for every treasurer that's out there. Most likely it's not. So they just got to go do their homework and make sure that they've established the right relationships with banks, that they've positioned the balance sheet to support the business in good times and in bad, and they should be okay.
They should be okay. And Paul, I actually agree with you because on my recent trip to India, I did see a lot of energy around business investment, foreign direct investment, as well as the fact that given its success story in in the realm of real-time payments and digital payments, as well as a lot of corporates wanting to invest in India, it certainly augurs well for India and the region, including China. So, yeah, I agree, and you raised some very interesting points, Paul. Next up, let's delve into the fourth story, which is about China using the digital yuan for gold cross border payments. Chinese media report that the Bank of China's Shanghai branch successfully transferred digital yuan 100 million or US $14 million central bank digital currency settlement received overseas for gold via the Shanghai Financial Exchange International Board. The account will contribute financial strength to support Shanghai's in-depth implementation of the Free Trade Pilot Zone promotion strategy and promote the quality and upgrading of the International Trade Center, a spokesperson for the Bank of China or BOC wrote. The transaction spanned Shanghai and Hong Kong, with Bank of China, Hong Kong also involved. BOC is the country's second largest bank and one of the big four state owned banks. Recently, the bank also participated in a cross border transaction for importing iron ore using China's central bank digital currency or CBDC, which involved Hong Kong and China's Baowu, the state owned iron and steel company. China's first cross border digital yuan usage for a commodities payment came in October when PetroChina used the CBDC. Paul, China's CBDC or digital yuan is expected to make significant advancements in cross border commodities payments. How do you think this will impact the world of cross border payments and global trade?
Yeah, Push. First of all, when you think about digital currency, especially what the work that China's been doing with the yuan, this is significant, right? Cross-border digital currency payment completed. This is another step forward, another point of success in what China is trying to do, get the digital yuan out there. I think you can safely say it's out there now. Yeah, it's not going away. The use within China is quite significant. It's been adopted quite quickly. So I think when we think about the use of these types of currencies in a digital form, it opens the door to a lot more in the future. So I think we're going to see a lot of quick adopters. We're going to see some followers. We're going to see some people still sitting on the sidelines and some that are just slower to come to the table. We've talked about this in the past. Both Europe and the US seem to be a lot slower in this range, and APAC region in general is embracing this quite readily. And so I think what's going to happen is once this is recognized that, it works, and it's validation that you have the right belts and suspenders in place to ensure that you don't have criminals misusing things, and you don't have them also with the easier ability to steal from organizations, then I think we'll see some additional adoption outside the APAC area. It doesn't mean that these types of digital currencies aren't being discussed or talked about in other regions. They are. They just seem to be a little bit slower about it. And there is some level of fear of, I lose some of my independency if I go to digital because it can be tracked everywhere. And some people just fear that, right? They do, and that's the way it is for some people. That's definitely a factor here in the US. You get people that talk about that. So does paper currency go away as long as it's still acceptable within like the US or Europe? Does it go away? Maybe not so fast, but at some point you got to believe that digital currency becomes the de facto payment system, and that paper currency and coins, other than for collection purposes, they disappear. So I remember back in the day when I was young, here in the US, we used to have gold and silver certificates. So our currency was backed by gold and silver. And eventually the US went away from that. So it became, just a notional currency. It didn't have gold and silver backing it up. Yeah, I'm sure there was a time that people thought, there's no way that we're ever going to do that. Well, it happened, right? And those have been taken out of circulation. Other than having that as a collection item, that's something that is not circulated today within the U.S. economy. You don't see those. So will that happen down the road? I think that will happen down the road, and it will become digital everywhere. I think at some point it will be digital everywhere. It's just another step towards, evolvement in terms of finance and how we pay for things. And I think the number one thing is, like I talked about earlier, is it secure? Are you able to manage it in a way where the risks associated with somebody misusing a currency like this, then, I think you'll have better adoption rates. But this is definitely a big thing for China. I think China's going to be looking at this, hey, we've done this. We know this works. It's valid. Let's keep it going. So I think we're going to see more of it.
Well, that's a valid argument you presented, Paul. Finally, Paul, what is your choice for the biggest or the most important story of the past week? And if I may ask, why?
Yeah, Push, if I was to, pick one of these going into 2024, my eye is going to be around not only the global elections, but also the conflicts that exist out there. And there's a lot of headwinds, I think, in 2024. I would not say that the trade relations with the U.S. is in the best point, that it should be. The meeting that Biden had with Xi Jinping in San Francisco felt like it was less than stellar. Probably good from a China perspective, but when I think about the relationship that we have with China, especially going into 2024, if Biden is no longer president, the president we have in place may have very different views than what Biden has displayed. So, I think it could increase the relationship with China writ large. So I think there's definitely some headwinds when it comes to trade relations. The conflicts in Ukraine and in the Middle East, those feel like they're not, well, obviously Ukraine is still going on. How long Ukraine's able to sustain and have enough support outside to keep that conflict going so that they can try to gain back their country, that's a big question mark. In the Middle East, that doesn't seem like it's shutting down anytime soon. So 2024 could present itself in a way that these conflicts expand into a broader regional issue versus something that's more localized. It's been contained to this point, but it definitely has the ability to, lack of a better term, for somebody to fan the flames and to expand it further. Will that happen? I have no idea. But, these are things that I think are big risks, not just from a specific country, but from a global perspective. So I think these things have global impacts. And I'm going to be keeping my eye on them for sure.
Well, you're absolutely right. And given the fact that the Russia-Ukraine war will complete 2 years on 24th February next year, 24th February 2024, and the Israel-Hamas conflict is close to, almost completing 3 months, the 7th January 2024, it would complete 3 months. Certainly is a cause of concern, and you're right, corporate treasurers will have to be extremely watchful, as they enter 2024. Well, we've come to the end of this podcast episode, Paul. Thank you for sharing your thought-provoking viewpoints. They've contributed significantly to the richness of today's episode. We would also like to express our deep gratitude to our CTM File audience for joining us on this edition of the Open Treasury podcast. Please subscribe and look in the show notes for the article links. Thank you and have a wonderful week and a very happy 2024. This podcast is provided for information purposes only, and statements made by CTM File or guests on this podcast are not intended as legal, business, or consulting advice. For more information, visit ctmfile.com.